Alright, hello, good day everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the assessment of intelligence. So I'm going to discuss different principles of human intelligence, and then from there, I am going to connect that to the different implications and applications that we will do when we assess a person's intelligence. So let's start by discussing the different principles of intelligence. Number one, you have to understand as a psych major that intelligence is defined differently. Maraming versions, maraming paraan kung paano dinidefine yung intelligence ng iba't ibang mga psychologist. And that's very understandable because intelligence is a very complex construct. We cannot capture intelligence, the meaning of intelligence, in just one simple definition. In fact, I want to compare this to the analogy of the blind man and the elephant. I'm sure you've heard of this, no? There were blind men and they were trying to understand, they were trying to describe what is an elephant. The problem is, these blind men were saying different things about the elephant. Sabi nung isa, an elephant is a wall. Yung isa, the elephant is a spear. Yung isa, the elephant it's like a rope, so on and so forth. They were saying different things about the elephant, but they were all describing an elephant. The same thing with intelligence. Intelligence is very complex. So different psychologists would define intelligence in different ways, but we are all talking about intelligence. So, some examples of definitions of intelligence. Intelligence is a person's ability to respond to a stimulus using sensory motor capability. Intelligence is a person's ability to use words and numbers to adapt to his or her everyday life. In another definition, intelligence is one's ability to solve problems in different domains or the ability to adjust and survive in a given environment. Tatlo pa lang yan. Definitely in the field, there are more than 3 definitions of intelligence, as in, ang dami. So what's the implication of that? If intelligence is defined in many different ways, one implication is this explains why there are many IQ tests in the market. That is a very common question that I receive from students about IQ test, no? Bakit maraming IQ test? Bakit iba-iba ng pangalan yung IQ test when they are all measuring the same thing, which is intelligence? What's the answer? Because different psychologists don't agree to each other how should we define intelligence. Meron silang mga kanya-kanyang mga version. And as a result, the way they will measure intelligence will also differ in approach. Iba-iba rin sila ng approach sa pagsusukat ng katalinuhan. So again, going back to the market, kaya marami tayong mga klase ng IQ test. Meron tayong Wechsler, meron tayong Sternberg, iba pa yung Universal Nonverbal Intelligence, so on and so forth. Now, a common question I usually get from a student is, given all these IQ tests, edi ang dami-dami niyan sa market, how do I know which one I will use? That's a good question, and the answer to that question is, it depends on what expression of intelligence do you want to measure. Kasi nga, complex yung intelligence, maraming forms yan, maraming expressions yan. Deductive reasoning, pwedeng analytical ability, pwedeng ability to read non-verbal cues. Depende kung ano yung gusto mong sukatin dyan. From there, now you can decide which of these tests will you use. Another implication of this, we are still under principle number 1, if intelligence is defined in different ways, assessment of general intelligence is extremely limited. Ito kasi yung pinaka-basic way on how to measure intelligence, right? You give the person an IQ test and then you compute for the raw score and then you consult the norm and the norm will tell you the meaning of the general IQ. But the problem is, if you just have the general IQ of a person, you can only say so much about the person. Wala ka masyadong masasabi tungkol sa kanya. Kasi general IQ yun eh. Intelligence is so rich na marami siyang ganyang expressions. So kapag nag-focus ka lang sa general IQ, hindi masyado magiging comprehensive yung understanding mo about the person's intelligence. So how do you apply this principle or this idea? You really need to make a decision before you assess a person's intelligence. What expression of intelligence do you want to quantify? Halimbawa, sa recruitment, let me explain the meaning of this red box right here, no? Halimbawa, sinabihan ka ng boss mo, you are working under HR, recruitment. Your boss tells you, I want you to recruit people who are smart. I only want smart employees for my company. Now, that statement of the boss refers to general IQ. Diba? Basta matalino kunin mo. Pero you have to be very specific. Now, you explain to your boss, Boss, given the mission vision of our company, given the function of our company, what specific expression of intelligence do you consider important for our company? O di syempre, mag-iisip yung boss mo, no? And then, ipakita mo yung iba't ibang expressions of intelligence. And then from there, kapag sinabi ng boss mo, oh, alright, I want practical people in my company. Ayan, yung number 3 yan, no? Practical people. So that means you are after practical reasoning. Gusto mo yung expression ng intelligence na number 3. Practical reasoning. So what do? You will find an IQ test that will measure a person's practical reasoning. Not just general IQ. You want an instrument that can measure a person's practical reasoning. Why? Because that is what your boss wants for the company. That is the kind of expression, intelligence expression, that your boss wants for his company. Another implication, if intelligence is defined in different ways, don't worship one specific intelligence test. Believe it or not, may mga psychometricians kasi na masyado silang fan ng isang psychological test, specifically IQ test, that no matter what the situation is, no matter what the clinical need is, they will stick to that intelligence test. Hindi dapat. Dapat open-minded ka na maraming klase ng intelligence test at pwede kang gumamit ng iba't ibang IQ test depende kung anong expression of intelligence ang gusto mong sukatin. Okay? So don't just stick with one IQ test. You have to be open-minded enough to try out different IQ tests available. Another implication is, I told you, maraming implication yung principle number 1, no? Don't take for granted non-academic intelligences. If you go back to the list of different forms of intelligence or expressions, marami dito very biased sa academic expression. Marami dyan, nakikita mo yan, o makikita mo yung mga expressions na yan in the four corners of the classroom. But we know in intelligence research that there are certain forms and types of intelligence that are not captured in the four corners of the classroom. Merong mga forms of intelligence na outside the academic world. So yun yung sinasabi nung slide dito. Don't take for granted those non-academic intelligences. Maghanap ka rin ng mga instruments na merong kakayanan na sukatin yung intelligence ng tao that is not expressed within the four corners of the classroom. In fact, that's the reason why Howard Gardner constructed his own multiple intelligences test, because he feels that the traditional school is so biased measuring intelligences that are valued in school. Masyado na tayong obsessed na sukatin yung mathematical intelligence, logico-mathematical, so on and so forth. How about those intelligences that are outside the school? Dapat kaya rin nating i-measure yun. Kaya gumawa si Gardner ng kanyang multiple intelligences theory where this instrument came from. Same thing with Sternberg. Isa rin yan sa mga issue ni Sternberg eh. May mga intelligences hindi masyadong nakikita sa classroom setting, such as, ayan, analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and practical intelligence. Actually, ang mas hindi kita talaga sa classroom are the two, no? Creative and practical. Analytical, ito yung academic talaga eh. But we should not take for granted creative and practical intelligence. Open din tayo dapat na gumamit ng mga instruments that measure those intelligences. So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2, intelligence has neurological basis. So when you hear the words neurological basis, intelligence is very connected to the quality of your brain. So how smart a person is, meron niyang direct link sa biological quality of the brain. And there are many evidences to prove that, like number 1, napatunayan na yan na kapag may certain parts of the brain ang nadadamage, one of the effects is nagkakaroon ng cognitive impairment such as low IQ. Evidence number 2 comes from different MRI studies. If you let a person do intellectual tasks in the laboratory, pagawan mo sila ng mga tasks that hits the following expressions of intelligence, anong sinasabi ng MRI? There are certain brain parts that are hard at work, which tells you that some of these expressions of intelligences are handled by certain parts of the brain. So meron talagang neurological basis yung intelligence, no? Malakas ang impluwensya ng biology in terms of how smart a person is. But let's connect this principle to an implication in assessing intelligence, kaya meron tayong assessment of intelligence in the laboratory setting. Remember, assessment of intelligence does not only happen in a classroom or in a clinic, but you can also go to hospitals and assess a person's intelligence. So meron tayong mga technologies in those hospitals where we can assess a person's intelligence. Hindi lang tayo puro paper and pencil. And what do you call these kinds of tests that go beyond being a paper and pencil test? Ito yung neuropsychological test according to APA. Any of various clinical instruments for assessing cognitive impairment, including those measuring memory, language, learning, attention, and visuospatial and visual constructive functioning. Alright, so for example, you would like to confirm if a person is suffering from Alzheimer's disease. It destroys your general intelligence, di ba? So kung gusto mong talagang ma-confirm na ang tao may Alzheimer's disease, what do? You need to take neuropsychological tests. That person needs to take neuropsychological test to confirm kung talaga nga bang meron siyang Alzheimer's disease. Okay? So, anong tawag doon? Neuropsychological test usually being done in laboratories. Principle number 3 about intelligence. Intelligence is plastic. When you hear the word plastic in psychology, we are referring to neuroplasticity, the ability of your brain to change its structure depending on the stimulation. Yun ang ibig sabihin pag plastic yung brain mo. Your brain can adapt to changes. It can change in its structure to adapt to a certain demand in the environment. So, this is good news. Let's say you have low levels of intelligence. Given that intelligence is plastic, what does that mean? You can train yourself or quote-unquote shape your brain to become smarter. That's possible. Improvement is possible because the brain, which handles more or less intelligence, is plastic. O kaya, ang implication dito sa assessment is, any assessment of intelligence is not final not definitive, and not predictive. What do I mean? Kapag nagsasabi ka ng assessment of intelligence, you're saying something about the level of intelligence of a client, don't make it sound like that forever, in the lifetime, yun na yung intelligence niya. Hindi ganon. Hindi ganon yung nature ng intelligence. Again, we are coming from neuroplasticity. If the brain is plastic, then there is no point setting. There is no point being final or definite about the person's overall level of intelligence. Because some people, ganun yung pananaw sa raw score sa IQ test eh. Kapag nakakita ng ganitong raw score sa IQ test, what do they think? This is me until I grow old. Ganyan na yung IQ ko. That's not how intelligence works. Whatever raw score you get from an IQ test, that is the capability of the person at that moment that you gave the test. But after he or she takes the test, marami pang pwedeng mangyari in the environment that can either improve that person's intelligence or decrease the person's intelligence. In other words, wala pang final. So kapag nakakakuha tayo ng IQ score, let's not say that that's written in the stone. In fact, one of the most popular textbooks in assessment, sila Groth and Marnat, no? Meron silang sinabi about that issue. Let me read, and I quote, "The IQ is not a measure of an innate fixed ability, nor is it representative of all problem-solving situations. It is a specific and limited sample made at a certain point in time of abilities that are susceptible to change." Let me repeat, susceptible to change. Ibig sabihin, the brain is plastic because of variety of circumstances. That's why, again, ang application dito, whenever you are writing assessment about a person's intelligence, nothing is written in the stone. Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na ito yung IQ niya, kaya pala siya ganyan, at hindi na siya pwede magbago until the day he or she dies. No. Whatever IQ score you get is that person's intelligence at that moment. And anytime, that overall intelligence can still change. In fact, yung libro ni Carol Dweck supports that idea, mindset. Specifically, growth mindset. We need to educate people about that nature of intelligence, that your overall IQ is not yet final. Because again, many people, they have the belief that your IQ, since it's biological, wala na, fixed na yan. Ayaw ni Carol Dweck yun. If you read this book, di ba, she compares the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. So in looking at intelligence, we need to be adapting the growth mindset. Kahit anong IQ score pa yung nakuha mo ngayon, ngayon lang yan. Pwede pa yung tumaas or pwede ring bumaba, but don't think that your IQ score can define your entire life or can define your future. Yon, yung ating lecture for principle number 3. Okay? Are there any questions? If you have any questions, mag-comment lang kayo dyan sa baba. So again, today, ang ginawa natin, we discussed different assessment principles when we deal with a person's intelligence. So reviewin nyo na lang yung mga sinabi ko, i-replay nyo na lang if you want repetition. Kung wala na, let's call it a day. Thank you everyone for listening. Sir Howard here. Have a great day. Bye-bye.